bring in John Boothman. He's political correspondent at the Sunday Times in Scotland. Good afternoon to you, John.
How are you doing, Julia?
Very well indeed. Thanks very much for joining us. Is everyone overplaying this? Is this a massively significant victory? Look, we're going into Labour conference starting this weekend in Liverpool. It's a lovely boost for Keir Starmer. Is the idea that actually winning a seat like this, with this big swing, 20%, that this is the deciding factor in what happens in the next general election across the country?
I think the context of this is really, really interesting. 2 years ago, not long after Anas Sarwar took over the Labour Party in Scotland, Labour was 30 points behind the SNP. A year ago, when Liz Truss became the Prime Minister, Labour was 20 points behind the SNP. The big beneficiaries of what happened when she became Prime Minister for 44 days in Scotland were actually Labour and not the SNP. 6 months ago, just more than that, when Nicola Sturgeon left office as First Minister, Labour was 10 points behind the SNP. Couple of polls last month actually showed Labour neck and neck with the SNP. And then you get this result last night. Yesterday, it was pouring of rain. There was a football match at on the telly. Everybody was talking about a really low turnout, and that would depress the Labour vote in particular, even though they've been working very hard in the constituency. Nobody thought that the margin of victory would be what it was. Yeah. It ended up at 58% of the votes that Labour won. That 20% swing that you're talking about. The SNP went from 23,000 votes in 2019 to just over 8,000 votes, a drop of 15,000. They're trying to say that it was Tory votes that brought the victory from Labour last night, when actually Labour's been winning votes from everybody, including the SNP.
Indeed, I mean, there are so many factors.
That's the critical bit of it.
And there's so many factors here, aren't they? Wanting to, a bit of a kick in the backside for the Tories, obviously, but also mostly for SNP. A lot of anger of Margaret Ferrier, the original sitting SNP MP, for what she did. Other people obeying the rules, lives completely destroyed by those COVID restrictions. Now I'll just get on a train when I've got COVID. I mean, it was totally irresponsible. Given that she was someone voting for a lot of those rules. And there's one thing us Brits don't like, it's hypocrisy in our politicians. We punish that, and quite rightly. But there's also a lot of anger, isn't there, about what's happened with Scotland under SNP. They were, it's a one-party state for quite a few years now, under Alexander, then under Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, almost like the woman could do no wrong. She was walking on water. She resigns. A big trans controversy. And then, of course, we saw her husband and the treasurer of the party all arrested. No one's faced any charges, but an ongoing police investigation into some missing, £600,000 of SNP finances. Had Sam Armstrong's reference to a camper van as well, bought, it would appear, with some finances from the SNP, but parked for some reason on Nicola Sturgeon's mother-in-law's drive. I mean, the plot thickens now, but there's an ongoing police investigation, and we won't go further than that on it. But is this, do you think, a reaction to a lot of that, as opposed to, we want to give Keir Starmer a chance?
Yeah, I think, look, it's very much the case that this is more about the SNP's troubles rather than Labour having some big offer that people in Scotland have rallied around. If anything, people have been very critical of both Starmer and of Anas Sarwar for not actually producing enough flesh in the bones, enough meat in terms of policy. But it's very, very definitely the case, as you rightly point out, that the demise of Nicola Sturgeon, the whole police investigation and everything surrounding it, and that's not finished yet, remember. It could have some way still to go. Margaret Ferrier and her, as Hamza Yusuf called it the other day, reckless and dangerous behaviour, all of those fed into that result last night. What will happen next, of course, is that, as you rightly said earlier, they've got the Labour conference coming up. There'll be some momentum around that. One of the things that's fascinating for me, having followed by-elections over so many years, is that actually for the first time in decades, I would say, Labour had a better on-the-ground campaign than the SNP. Yeah. SNP activists, you have to remember, if you've joined the SNP in the last 20 years, you've actually had a period of unparalleled success. At this by-election, for the first time, people were getting stick SNP members getting criticised in the doors for all this stuff that we're talking about. And do you know what? They've never had that before. And that led to a place that really they didn't do the work. Labour's campaign was more effective, and you've seen the results of it in terms of Michael Shanks winning.
Yeah. But again, it's different, how you handle yourself when the party's, luck has gone past is very telling. Let me ask you just finally also about Humza Yousaf, of course, took over, the chosen one to take over from Nicola Sturgeon. Quite extraordinarily, on the day of this by-election, the Time magazine, international magazine, decided to feature him on the front cover, talking about him as one of the new generation of trailblazers shaping the future as a rising star, obsessed, of course, as all these magazines are, with the fact that he's the first person from an ethnic minority background to hold this particular role. But it is extraordinary, given the absolute collapse in the polls under the SNP and all the chaos that's going on in Scottish politics right now, that he should be hailed as this sort of trailblazer in an international magazine.
I think the difficulty now for Humza Yousaf in their conferences a couple of days after the Labour conference is that you're now going to get quite a lot of criticism of him. Already, certainly off the record, you've gotten some mumping and moaning about the policy direction of the party, about the personalities that he's brought in. Why has he left, for example, Kate Forbes out of his cabinet, the person who he defeated in that bruising leadership election? So I think in the next few days, there might be a bit of a backlash really against Humza, and we'll see where all of that goes.
It's going to be fascinating to watch. Great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your analysis there. That's John Boothman, political correspondent at the Sunday Times in Scotland.